Have you ever created a world for your campaign or your story and struggled to make that history feel real at the table when it came time to actually deliver? It's one of the biggest challenges of world building. How do you create a sense of depth without overwhelming yourself or your players with these unnecessary details or lore dumps? Well, I think the answer lies in the way that we layer our history. So let's talk about how you can break down your history to create a world that feels rich, that feels authentic and grounded, and do it quickly in just 3 steps. Now, the first layer of history, of your history, is ancient history, the unknowable past. This is the time that is shrouded in mystery, where myths and legends probably dominate the narrative. Most people in your world won't know much, if anything, about this period because there was just no eyewitnesses, there's no records. If they exist, they're incomplete, they're distorted or lost. Now, obviously, creatures like elves that live hundreds of years are exceptions to that, and they should feel like that.
I was there, Gandalf. I was there 3,000 years ago.
Ancient history is where you can introduce the foundations of your world. What great civilizations rose and fell in that time? What cataclysmic events shaped the geography or gave rise to the gods that are being worshipped in the current age? Those myths don't need to be super detailed. In fact, the less that you explain, the more intriguing it can be. And then you can think about artifacts or traditions that are passed down from this time that might still survive to this day, how it's influenced the culture and beliefs of your world, but much of that should also remain open to interpretation because leaving those gaps in ancient history actually creates room for mystery and enigma, and players will fill in the gaps with their imagination, I promise, and it will be so much better that way. Now, for example, what I mean is that in our own ancient history for millennia, if you think about the pyramids of Egypt or the lost city of Atlantis, while historians and archaeologists have uncovered some truths, much of it remains speculative or steeped in folklore. In your world, you can use similar ideas like massive ruins of this forgotten ancient civilization or these artifacts from a long time ago that are unclear about what they do, or tales of gods that walked among mortals. Those are elements that create a sense of awe and curiosity that pull players deeper into your story. Your players can stumble into a crumbling city deep in the jungle. They can find inscriptions on the walls that talk about maybe a once mighty empire, but their meaning is really unclear. You're not sure if it's a warning or if it's a prophecy or if it's just a shopping list. The ambiguity invites players to engage with the world and make it their own because they will fill in the gaps in much the same way that we fill in the gaps when we're watching movies like Spirited Away that have these really soft world build. They have really, that sounds weird. Worlds that are built soft. They were built and they were done softly. Now, next up is recent history. Those are events that are maybe within living memory, like World War I or World War II. There's probably still people alive. There's a little bit of leeway because we can think about our own world and we have a general understanding of what happened 100 years ago, 200 years ago, even 500 years ago, right? Christopher Columbus, 1492 or whatever the year was. Is it 1492? 1492, Christopher Columbus sailed the ocean blue, right? Christopher Columbus, 1492, Christopher Columbus sailed the ocean blue, I can talk. So unlike ancient history, recent history is better documented. It's still subject to interpretation, obviously. Different cultures, different factions, and individuals will have their own versions of what's happened, and this level of your history, this layer, allows you to explore conflicts and revolutions and alliances that have shaped the current world. For example, if there's a great war that ended a generation ago, well, some older NPCs might talk about their roles in that conflict. Maybe there are soldiers or refugees that were there.
I was there, Gandalf.
Or people who saw it firsthand or lived during the occupation of their cities or whatever. But you can also have younger characters that only know the war through biased history books or through stories that were passed down from their parents. And this creates a really amazing opportunity for roleplay and tension because you can have 2 different sides or 2 different understandings of the same story. Even though we know what happened, there's different sides that interpret it differently. Right? Did that war really truly end peacefully, or are there unresolved scars that continue to fester? Now, another way to make recent history compelling is to show how it impacts the present. For example, if there was a revolution that failed, it could leave behind this really shattered kingdom that's now ruled by an iron-fisted dictator. Or maybe there was a natural disaster that displaced entire populations and it created social and political instability, and that's the world that your players are living in now. The key is to use recent history to connect it to the past for your players, so that they can experience the world in a deeper and more meaningful way. And then finally, we reach modern history, which I think of as the immediate present, right? This is the layer that your players will interact with the most, so it should feel the most detailed and immersive. Modern history includes the current events, political climate of the area, whether that's a good or bad political climate, and thinking about the everyday life of your world. It's where the past and the present really come together, shaping the choices and the challenges that your players are going to face. So in the modern day, the weight of those ancient myths and that recent history as well can be felt. For example, the crumbling ruins of ancient civilization now serve as the battleground for two rival factions that are trying to control this ancient artifact down in the depths of this ancient city. A kingdom that's rebuilding after a recent war might be struggling with food shortages or corruption, right? There was a thing in the past that is causing X or Y. These elements make the world feel alive and dynamic and changing and evolving, and it gives your players the sense that their actions can actually influence the course of history. Everyday life is also a really important part of modern history. What people eat, how they travel, what they fear, if they're living in shadow of a tyrant, or if they're just trying to survive another harsh winter. Those little details really ground the world and make it relatable, even if it's filled with magic and all of these fantastical creatures. You don't need to break away from realism in order to have fantasy. I don't think that they're mutually exclusive. And by layering your world's history with ancient history, recent history, and modern history, you create a narrative that feels authentic, it feels engaging, it's got mystery in the right places to create this sort of enigmatic past that feels complete, and it adds detail to the present, which makes it feel real. So what do I do? How do I make it easy for myself? Well, I will pick one or two ancient events like a war, or ancient civilization, or celestial event, or a cataclysm, and let that be the defining moment for timekeeping. It's the farthest back that we tend to generalize, like how we say things like, as old as the pyramids. Do we know how old they are off the top of our heads? Well, maybe not. The general population probably doesn't, but we know they're old, like thousands of years old, and we have a vague, if not stereotypical idea of what ancient Egypt looked like, and that fuels a huge part of our understanding of the ancient world. Whether it's correct or not is not the point. What I'm trying to say here is that our understanding of ancient history influences a lot of what we understand about the modern world, even if it is not correct. Now, after I've chosen that ancient event or two, then I'll choose one or two recent events to act as the bridge between the ancient world and the modern world. These events are usually significant enough that they shape the world as it exists now, but they're still within the realm of living memory, or at least well documented enough that people have opinions about them. So, for example, maybe there was a massive war that ended a few decades ago. This war might have reshaped the local borders. It's destroyed a few empires. Maybe the empire that they're living in now has grown because of that. It's created new power structures. Alternatively, you could also pick a natural disaster if you don't want to go for the political climate thing. Maybe a volcanic eruption or a magical catastrophe has left scars on the land and the people.
Oh, Pompeii.
And that's the world that we're stepping in now, or that's something that's happened recently and has been affecting the local population. The key here is to just pick an event that is still being felt in the world to this day, whether that's through a lingering political tension or displaced populations or economic instability, or because the world is literally on fire because there's a crazy firestorm or something, right? Something that can be felt now. And then by focusing on a small number of those defining moments, you give your world a sense of history without overwhelming yourself or your players with these unnecessary details. It's not about listing every single thing that's ever happened ever and making sure that you know all of that and you have it all memorized. It's really about choosing specific events that resonate and create context for your story and for the present. Once I have that ancient and recent history chosen, I move on to modern history. And this is where I really zoom in on what's happening right now and how it ties to the past and add those details. What are the political and social issues dominating the world? Who's in power right now? How secure is their rule? Are there factions that are vying for control? Have there been some grudges that have resurfaced? Are there remnants of ancient forces that are coming together? The modern day is where your players will spend most of their time, so it's worth adding all of those little details here and now to make the world feel alive and feel dynamic. Think about how people live their daily lives, what they value, what they fear. For example, if the ancient cataclysm still haunts the world, then maybe there are rituals or taboos tied to preventing another disaster. If the recent war has left orphans or refugees, then there might be entire towns that are run by displaced communities that are trying to rebuild. The beauty of this approach is that it keeps world building manageable, because while you're still creating a sense of depth, you're not having to build an encyclopedia. You're creating a living, breathing world that feels like it has a history by focusing on one or two key events for each era, and then creating a foundation for players to explore and discover in the modern day without overwhelming yourself with all the details in the past. And really all that comes down to is just thinking about it realistically, as far as what would you know if you were living in this world? Would you know everything that happened 10,000 years ago? Would you know everything that happened 20,000 years ago? Honestly, probably not. Realistically, you would probably only know what happened within the last 1 to 500 years. And the farther away it gets, the more mysterious it becomes. So at the table, these layers also give you flexibility, right? Because ancient history provides mystery and room for interpretation, which just lets your players do the work for you. And recent history adds context, it adds depth. And then modern history sets the stage for your story and gives your players a world to interact with. Remember, history is also not about what happened, it's also how we remember and interpret those events. That's where the magic really happens. Those gaps and those biases in history are what make it feel real, because that's exactly how it works in the real world. So when designing history for your world, keep it simple, layer on top of it, keep it relevant, right? Make sure that you've got ancient history and recent and modern. Each layer has its own role in making the world feel authentic. And as your players are diving into the mysteries and all of that past stuff and grappling with the weight of recent events, you have a world that feels rich, it feels immersive, and it feels alive. Now, what's your favorite piece of history in a world that you've created? Share your ideas down below. I want to hear how you've built your worlds. Anyways, I hoped this helped. I think it was just a lot of ranting, but you know what? I'm gonna go ahead and keep it. So thank you so much for watching. For John, my friends, and we'll see you next time, adventurers.